End of the line. Britain's biggest selling newspaper puts a scandal to bed while a former editor faces arrest. Hello there, I'm Sheila Ghosh. The rest of the day's top stories here on Al Jazeera. Syria accuses the US of interfering after its ambassador takes a trip to the flashpoint city of Hama. Executed. A Mexican man is put to death in Texas despite international calls for a delay. Plus, history may have to wait as NASA's last ever space shuttle mission faces delays. Britain's best-selling newspaper, The News of the World, is to be shut down after a phone hacking scandal involving victims of crime. International media mogul Rupert Murdoch is well known for his ability to capitalise on public opinion. But the decision to make Sunday's edition of the UK's most successful paper the last is attracting awe and anger in equal measure. There are reports that former editor Andy Coulson could be arrested later on Friday. He resigned from his post as Director of Communications to the UK Prime Minister due to the scandal earlier this year. Critics claim the paper's current 250 members of staff aren't the problem. Former editor Rebecca Brooks has been questioned twice by police and Parliament for her involvement in hacking and admitting to paying police officers for tip-offs. But she's to keep her position in charge of the British newspapers for News Corp. The last edition this Sunday will run with no adverts. Murdoch's organisation lost over $1 billion in value as its shares slumped in recent days. Well, Antony Loewenstein is an independent journalist and author and joins me now live from Sydney. Good to have you with us. We were talking earlier about the international fallout from what's happened in the UK, and the power and influence of Rupert Murdoch in Australia cannot be underestimated, can it?
Well, Rupert Murdoch, in fact, here has the most tightly concentrated media in the world. 70% of the print press is controlled by him. And what you've seen over the last 2 or 3 decades in Australia is both sides of politics, a bipartisan agreement that Murdoch should have more and more power, to the point now where there's virtually no transparency in the relationship between his empire and the political elites. And I think one thing that is always called for by many of us who would like a more independent press is an inquiry into how that relationship works, how that money is transferred, and more importantly, how governments on both sides give Murdoch too much power over the political and media elites. Yeah,
there is a question, isn't there, about how close politicians are to journalists, which have allowed these very dubious, questionable practices to build up.
I think it's very much a cosy relationship. You see, I think, in Britain in the last sort of few years, as the Guardian has exposed these transgressions, and indeed in Australia as well, is how many journalists, in fact, like to be close to power. And the Murdoch press particularly thrives on that, because rarely, if ever, do the political elites actually challenge that power. As you said, in Britain, you've seen over decades both sides of politics, Labor and the Tories, be more than happy to rely on Rupert Murdoch to support them as future leaders of the country. In Australia, it's very much the same. We have a current Prime Minister of the so-called left, who is more in the centre-right, and she's essentially would always see Rupert Murdoch when she visits America or when he comes to Australia. So there's a relationship there without the public, all of us, understanding how that relationship works. And the only party in Australia, the Greens, who are the third major party, have been calling for many years for an independent inquiry into how that relationship works, and many of us would like that to happen sooner rather than later, including from today.
Do you think there should be a much bigger investigation into this scandal, and how far should it go?
Well, in many ways, what we've seen in Britain, I think, is the question of thugs in suits. I mean, the closing of News of the World seems to me as an attempt to try and lance the boil. I mean, clearly the problem is not so much the staff who work for the paper, although clearly some staff transgressed and broke laws. The issue is more the direction the newspaper organisation has from the top, from Murdoch down. Rebecca obviously is, from the UK, clearly is going to remain in that position, allegedly. Andy Coulson, who was hired only recently by Number 10 as David David Cameron. He was then fired, of course, a few months ago. And in Australia, it's a very similar situation. There needs to be arguably an inquiry in many countries, including in America, into the influence of how the Murdoch press operates, and most importantly, to break up its power. You can't have a healthy media environment in a democracy when, for example, 70% of the print press in my country, Australia, is owned by one man. In Britain, we shouldn't forget the attempt of the Murdoch press to take more control of B-Sky B only recently was going to go through. There were no questions being asked by the Cameron government then, and now maybe there'll be questions, and I think this needs to happen immediately.
And clearly no one's condoning what News of the World journalists have done, what the investigator did in hacking into phone voicemails. But there is this overwhelming pressure, and the investigator spoke about this as well, an overwhelming pressure to get the stories, because this is what the public want. They read this kind of stuff.
Well, the argument, of course, always is the public demands more and more salacious details of information, and clearly News of the World was the biggest selling newspaper in the country. So yes, there was a demand for that kind of information. However, this is not just about celebrity gossip anymore. We've got to the stage now, and it appears to be very clear in Britain, when News of the World was essentially trying to hack into victims of 7/7 terrorist attack, into soldiers' families who had been killed in Afghanistan or Iraq. This has taken it to a whole new level, and we shouldn't presume, of course, that only the Murdoch press is guilty of these kind of crimes. Other media organisations should be investigated too. The question, I think, really needs to be that in any healthy democracy, one organisation or one family should not have so much power over the media. And I think especially in an age now we have satellite television, the internet and other mediums, it's vital, I think, that governments of both stripes of major political powers change that and challenge that. And I think there'll be a lot of pressure. In fact, just today in Australia, the head of the Murdoch empire here, John Hartigan, released a statement talking about how the ethics that have been breached in Britain simply don't happen here. The truth of the matter is, on a weekly basis, the Murdoch tabloids in Australia and much of the world print information which is ethically suspect on a weekly basis. And although much of the audience might consume that, there are questions that need to be asked about ethical breaches and, more importantly, an independent journalism code that is rarely enforced by so-called independent bodies in Britain, America and Australia.
Some interesting points there. Thanks very much indeed for your analysis. Antony Loewenstein speaking to us from Sydney. Now, Syria has accused the United States of sending its ambassador to a flashpoint city without proper clearance. Robert Ford visited Hama on Thursday to show solidarity with the residents. The country's foreign minister has been quoted as saying the presence of the US ambassador in Hama without prior permission from the foreign ministry is clear evidence of the United States' involvement in current events in Syria and its attempt to incite an escalation in the situation, which disturbs Syria's security and stability. The US State Department responded by saying the fundamental intention was to make absolutely clear with his physical presence that we stand with those Syrians who are expressing their right to speak for change. Well, security forces have opened fire on demonstrators in the city of Harasta, just outside the capital, Damascus. Our source there says live ammunition was used against people inside a mosque. 3 people were killed. More protests have been staged in the city of Hama too. Tarek Baz